Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree. This is Video Game Buyer's Guide Part 4, the beloved Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES. Do not say that rubbish word at me. Do not call it the other thing. It's SNES or Super Nintendo, or just the Super. I'm good either way. If you live in Japan, it's the Super Famicom, but that's a whole separate system. And I'm going to do a whole separate video series on collecting outside of North America because I live in North America. So, what are you going to do? That's where my knowledge base and experience is from. The Super Nintendo, similar to the NES in a lot of respects, has a very robust aftermarket life. Now, the Super Nintendo, the machine, the physical hardware that Nintendo manufactured back in the day, comes in well, basically two flavors. You have the core Super Nintendo, the base system that most everybody had, and then you have the Super SNES 2, the Model 2, which is the smaller, more compact Super Nintendo. I had both as a kid. I was fortunate in that my parents didn't know anything about me, so they bought me a Super Nintendo one Christmas in 1997 or 98, 97 or 98, I forget which one it was, not knowing I already had a Super Nintendo because they didn't know anything about me. They knew they bought me a Sega Genesis. I bought the Super Nintendo myself with money I earned from jobs, so they didn't know I had one or they didn't know what it was. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I got two Super Nintendos as a kid. I loved it. Great system, fantastic fucking games. One of the greatest game consoles of all time. It's debatable. Some people prefer the Genesis. I do, but I also love the SNES. So, you know, yeah, I love the Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo comes in, like I said, two hardware flavors from back in the day. Um, no um, add-ons or upgrades to speak of, like the Genesis or NES had. There's no disk system or anything like that. There's no CD-ROM. There's no, you know, upgrades. There are some accessories to note. There's the light gun, which I think it was called. What was it called? The Super Scope 6, I think is what it was called. Not as good as the Zapper on the NES, but still passable. It works for the time. Not so much today, unless you have a CRT, but it is what it is. I think it works with flat screens, but I'm not 100%, so don't quote me on this. I don't own a physical SNES. Don't got that kind of money. Never owned a Super Scope. Never had that kind of money. Your standard Super Nintendo comes with two controllers. They're a slightly enhanced version of the NES gamepad, but a slightly um, more primitive version of the PlayStation gamepad. So very familiar to modern gamers. They have the button layout that we're familiar with today. The diamond for the buttons, select start in the middle, the D-pad on the side, the shoulder buttons on the top. That comes from the Super NES. It was the first system to do it, and pretty much nearly everybody after has copycatted that controller in some way or another. So kudos to Nintendo for that. Um, Now, game catalog, the Super Nintendo does have a lot of unique original titles, um, mostly first party Nintendo titles, and some first party titles produced by third party companies. However, the Super Nintendo, unlike the Sega Genesis, which has a more unique, more original software library, the SNES is largely plagued with a lot of sequels and franchises and reboots and what we would call today remasters and re-releases and compilations and things of the sort. So it's definitely playing on nostalgia for people who already own the NES. So you have a lot of games on the Super Nintendo that are direct sequels to NES games. Turtles in Time, Castlevania 4, Super Metroid, Super Mario World, etc., etc. There's a Mega Man X I've already talked about. There's a lot of games on the Super NES that are at their core just sequels. So it does lose points for me for that because not a lot of originality on the SNES. There's not. It is mostly a sequel dump. It's okay. They're good sequels, but most of the games on the console that people are familiar with are sequels to franchises. Final Fantasy III is a big example. That's not to say every game on the system is, but let's get into it. The Super Nintendo also has a lot of it was where the what we refer to today as the JRPG or Japanese role-playing game pretty much went mainstream more or less. I say more or less because back in the day when the Super Nintendo was being sold and marketed, JRPGs were not successful. They were not financially successful in the US. They weren't. They existed and they found their audience, sure, and they sold well enough that there are plenty of them on the system. But if you were alive in the 90s, most people didn't know there were JRPGs on the console. Most people were playing Castlevania and Doom and Mario Kart and stuff like that. The JRPGs were for a specific subset of Super Nintendo gamers who are perfectly valid, don't get me wrong. I sometimes talk shit about the game, not the gamer, because I'm not a fan of JRPGs. But I have to be clear, and let's be real, they were not the reason why the Super Nintendo was a success at all back in the day. They weren't. Because back in the day, nobody knew about them. Yeah, people did. A, you know, a significantly large enough people bought JRPGs for them to exist and to and I have to harp on this. I have to because modern gamers brag about how the Super Nintendo is a JRPG gamer's wet dream. Yes, that's true, but that's not why the console was a success back in the day. If you look at the sales charts, none of the JRPGs cracked the top 50. None of them. Not even Final Fantasy III, which was the best selling JRPG on the console, next to maybe Super Mario RPG, which is kind of an action adventure game as well as a JRPG. So, like I said, we were not sold, nobody was, on the Super Nintendo because JRPGs. If you liked JRPGs, you bought the Super Nintendo, but most people didn't buy it for JRPGs. Does that make sense? Okay. Because I know today, retro gamers, modern retro gamers who are looking back, kids mostly, who are fans of JRPGs are looking back on it and they're discovering it because of the JRPGs, which again, they exist, but I have to point out they didn't light up the sales charts back in the day. They were not the reason we bought it. And I'm sorry for harping on it, but I'm sick and tired of people saying, oh, yeah, the Super Nintendo was the best console because it had Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy. No, it wasn't. It was the best console at the time because it had fucking Killer Instinct and Mortal Kombat 2 and Super Castlevania 4 and Legend of Zelda and Super Mario World and Mario Kart and, Donkey Kong Country. It had nothing to do with the JRPGs. They sold to their audience, but none of them sold over 1 million units. None of them. That's why they're rare today, because they didn't sell back then. Let's make that clear. Okay? I have to make that clear because more people bought it for the other games than the JRPGs than who bought it for the JRPGs. There's nothing wrong with JRPGs or buying it for that. If you did, I'm not going to dismiss you, but everyone else didn't. Everyone else bought it for the action games. They didn't buy it for the JRPGs. Everybody else was playing NBA Jam, all right? Or Star Fox, or even Doom, or Contra 3, or whatever. TMNT Turtles in Time. Yes, people were. Well, I said my piece. Let's move on. Now, that being said, the software library, again, doesn't have a lot of original titles. I have to be clear about that. It doesn't. Most of them are sequels or reboots or remasters. There are original titles, but again, they're usually reminiscent of a game that already existed on the NES or already existed on the Super NES. Um, that's not to say I'm not trying to downplay the Super Nintendo. I want to make that clear. It's still a great system. Even though most of them are sequels, they're probably the best sequel in the franchise, the version on the Super Nintendo. Super Metroid is the best Metroid. Zelda A Link to the Past is the best Zelda, etc. So a lot of times the best in those franchises was on the Super Nintendo. They peaked in the Super Nintendo era and then went downhill from there. That is actually the case for a lot of these franchises. So the Super Nintendo still deserves credit for having those games, but not too much credit because, they a lot of remakes and remasters and sequels, etc. franchises. No, not that that's a bad thing, but we're still plagued with that today. You know, having a goddamn hard time getting original games. So I do have to make that clear. Um, so most of the games people are gonna identify as the games to buy. Most of them are going to be sequels and franchises, or in the case of Mario Kart and Star Fox, the first entry in what would become long-running franchises. Technically, Donkey Kong Country is the beginning of a long-running franchise, but also a sequel to an existing franchise. It was a reimagining of a game franchise that already existed, the Donkey Kong series. So it works both ways in that instance, that particular game. Which, by the way, Donkey Kong Country is one of the greatest video games of all time. So I want to put that out there just in case people think I don't like Nintendo games, because I do. So I love the Super Nintendo, and it does have some great games. But let's bust some myths while we're talking about it, because it's worth busting the myths. The myths are worth busting. Um, Modern options for Super Nintendo. But before we get into that, who's it for? Who today should buy the Super Nintendo? Well, obviously Nintendo fans are going to want it. Gamers as a whole, if you're a gamer, you should definitely want a Super Nintendo because it has more than enough games to satisfy you. Retro gamers 1,000% want it. It's a must-have for retro gamers for obvious reasons. Um, Again, if you're a fan of any of these franchises, and we'll throw in the JRPGs. If you are a fan of JRPGs, you're gonna want the Super Nintendo because it's got a lot of them. If you're a fan of arcade style shoot 'em ups, you're gonna want a Super Nintendo. It's got a lot of them. If you're a fan of arcade fighting games, you're gonna want a Super Nintendo. It's got a bunch of them as well as 2D platformers. So yes, it's got a lot of great games on it. It absolutely does, and it is worth tracking down because it sold so well back in the day. Um, it's relatively inexpensive compared to other retro consoles because yeah, everybody wants one, but there's enough to go around. You know, um, if you have to be picky and you can only buy one, if you don't have the money to buy both, or if you're not a completist, get the Model One, the top loader with the eject button in the middle and the sliding power button. That's the one you want. You don't want the one with the rubber buttons that you have to yank the cartridge out yourself. You want to avoid that thing at all costs. Buy it as a collectible to put on your shelf, but if you're going to play Super Nintendo games on physical original hardware, get the original Super NES. Now, like the NES, the Super NES is equally robust when it comes to retro clones. So most retro clones most but not all, most retro clones that can play NES games can also play Super Nintendo games. That is pretty standard. So again, you have options if it comes to physical hardware. Um, Now there are standalone NES only retro clones. I don't think there's any standalone SNES only retro clones. I don't think. Um, so there is that. Now there are also some aftermarket plug and play TV games that come with Super Nintendo ROMs. Avoid those at all costs. And like the SNES or the NES Classic Mini, you have the SNES Classic Mini, which doesn't have as many games as the NES Classic. It's still a good selection of games. They're all worth owning. They're all worth playing. So that's another option. The Virtual Console on the Wii, the Wii U, and the eShop on the or not eShop, but Virtual Console on the Wii, eShop on the Wii U 3DS, and the Nintendo Online service or Nintendo Switch Online or whatever it's called are a good way to experience Super Nintendo games. Like NES, emulation is very robust. You can get plenty of emulators. The ROMs are readily available. And it's possible to emulate the SNES pretty much on anything that can emulate the NES. As mentioned in that video, Xbox, Wii, PSP, etc. Obviously, laptops, RetroPies, desktops, anything. Anything just about that can emulate the NES can also emulate the SNES. So emulation for me is the way to go, but not everybody wants that. So again, like the NES, you can get adapters that allow you to plug your original, authentic Nintendo manufactured gamepads into your computer using USB adapters. But you can also get aftermarket reproductions of Super Nintendo gamepads that come with the USB cord built in. That is another option. Fortunately, the Super Nintendo actually does use the same button layout that every controller that came after it does, with a handful of exceptions. So you can use an Xbox or a PlayStation controller um, as a substitute for your SNES controller, and you're not going to have that much difficulty. It's the same layout, same buttons. So it works. I use a PS3 USB gamepad is what I use when I play Super Nintendo games on my laptop. In the past, I've had authentic Super Nintendo controllers with the adapter and aftermarket Super Nintendo controllers with the USB plug. I've had both. Either works. They're both good. In my experience, um, look, let's be real. Let's be honest for a second. In my experience and the experience of most people that I know, Super Nintendo gamepads, while iconic, ergonomic, and innovative for the time, they're not as durable as Sega Genesis gamepads. If you buy an original, authentic Nintendo manufactured gamepad from back in the day, it's probably not going to last forever. The D-pad's going to come loose, the buttons are going to stick. Eventually, it's going to break down and cease to function well. Now, that's not to say the same thing doesn't happen to Genesis gamepads. It can, but in my experience, in most people's experience that I've observed, the Genesis controllers were a little bit more durable. They could handle the abuse of a kid who got angry at Mortal Kombat and threw it at the wall. The Super Nintendo controller couldn't. Which means they're harder to find today because they break easy and they're harder to repair. So you're most likely going to end up with an aftermarket reproduction anyways. Just meter your expectations. You're probably not going to get a working SNES gamepad that was manufactured in 1993. You're probably going to be getting a reproduction that looks close enough that is more durable and better functioning that will last longer, manufactured by somebody else that was made in 2013 or later. That's most likely what you're going to get. I'm just being real with you. I'm not trying to dog the SNES. I'm busting myths and bringing you the facts so that you don't get disappointed when you buy an authentic pad on eBay and the Y button sticks and you can't fix it because there's nobody who knows how to repair it or whatever. Just meter your expectations. Don't get angry at the eBay seller uh, because it's not their fault these gamepads break down. It's Nintendo's fault because they weren't well designed. Not as well designed, like I said, as Sega's controllers, later Nintendo controllers, or even the NES. They're just not as durable. They aren't for whatever reason. I don't know what that reason is. I don't know if it's because they use cheap rubber parts or what it is. I don't know. But this is just an actual fact of life you have to be aware of. When it comes to emulation, I'm not going to tell you which emulator is the best or which one I use. I use two different Super Nintendo emulators, again, because some games work better for one game than with one emulator than the other, etc. Um, there are multiple Super Nintendo emulators, but there's like two, I would argue, that stand above the rest, but you can figure that out yourself. You can Google. As far as emulating on consoles, I don't know how to do that. Xbox or whatever. I don't own an Xbox. But I hear it can be done relatively easily, so that's an option. Now, fortunately, the Super Nintendo did sell well enough, and the software library is robust enough that a lot of the Super Nintendo titles were reissued or re released on the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo DS, and later Nintendo consoles. So you can still get these games in other methods. You don't have to actually own a physical Super Nintendo or a retro clone. You can still get, comparable versions of the game, sometimes with enhancements or modifications. A lot of the games that originated on the SNES have Game Boy Advance counterparts, which we'll talk about when I get to the GBA video down the road. So there are other ways to enjoy Super Nintendo software without actually investing in physical Super Nintendo hardware or in the Nintendo digital ecosystem. Just letting you know. As far as collecting goes, you can get a physical original Super Nintendo relatively inexpensive compared to some other retro consoles. It's not going to break the bank. And most of your common Super NES titles, Super Mario World, Mario Kart, you know, Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, etc., they're not going to break the bank. You know, your less popular titles that didn't sell well back in the day but have a following today are going to be expensive, like your JRPGs. This is why, though they're expensive. Have you ever wondered why Earthbound cost $400? Because nobody bought it back in the day. Nobody bought a Super Nintendo to play Earthbound. I just want to harp on that one last time. But they did buy the Super Nintendo to play Super Mario World, and you're lucky Super Mario World is readily available in physical cartridge as well as available in the digital stores and a slightly enhanced modified version on the GBA if you want to go that route. So the Super Nintendo is relatively easy to collect for and relatively inexpensive to collect for, relatively compared to other retro consoles. Now, there are some expensive titles on the SNES, but fortunately, for whatever reason, they're not as expensive as the outrageously overpriced NES collector's items. So, good luck, but they're not out. You can get Earthbound on the Super Nintendo. You're not going to get um, Big Nose the dinosaur or whatever it's called, Big Nose the caveman or whatever it's called on the NES. You're just not going to unless you're rich. Um, you'll have an easier time getting Bonks 3 or Super Bonk or whatever it's called on the SNES than you will Bonk's Adventure on the NES. So, you know what I mean? There's also not as many unlicensed, unofficial titles on the SNES as there was on the NES. I want to point that out. Partially because the illegal Nintendo monopoly that Nintendo had on the NES, which was illegally forcing companies to sign exclusive contracts to only make games for the NES, which the courts eventually invalidated those contracts and let game companies make software for Sega Genesis and PlayStation, etc. Those contracts were not in place for the bulk of the Super Nintendo's lifespan. So a lot of third-party companies did abandon the SNES in the later years. So it's very top-heavy. A lot of your Konami, Capcom, not Sega, but SNK, Hudson Soft Games came out in the early years of the SNES, Namco, etc. And then once those companies were free of Nintendo's illegal contracts, they abandoned Nintendo. And history tells us most of them never looked back. That is unfortunate, but it is worth mentioning. But because of that, lesser third-party companies, smaller companies who didn't have the means to publish titles on the level of other companies like EA, etc., who would have had to resort to unlicensed software, cracked software on the NES, didn't have to on the SNES. So there's fewer examples, they do exist, but fewer examples of unlicensed software on the SNES. Which does mean the games aren't as collectible to some people because they're not as obscure or weird or rare. So for some people, collecting for the NES is more of a hobby, whereas collecting for the Super Nintendo was just, playing games. You're buying games to play them. On the NES, you're buying games to brag about owning them. It's a little bit different. I don't have anything disparaging to say about the Super Nintendo hardware. It's pretty good. It's more well built and better designed than the NES, so you can confidently buy a physical SNES and you can expect it to work. And if it doesn't for whatever reason, they're relatively easy to repair. Less so than that's less of a problem than it was on the NES. So you can buy in more confidence. Going forward, outside of the PS2 and the Xbox 360, pretty much if you buy a retro game console going forward, you can safely assume it still works today. The PS2, they break down notoriously at high numbers, and the Xbox 360 broke down at notoriously high numbers. But everything else, you're relatively safe from here on out, as is the case with the SNES. That's not to say they can't or don't break down, so buyer beware, but not as not they don't have the hardware issues the NES had. So they're a little bit more viable as a collectible than the NES is, just for that reason alone. Uh, Given the choice, I would pick NES over SNES personally, even though it has more issues, just because I was a kid. I played more NES than I did SNES. Because by the time I got to the 16-bit era, I had a Genesis. I got my Super Nintendo later. I don't have nostalgia for SNES like I do Genesis. So that does play a part. It really does. Um, but there it is. Enjoy.